home and via Zoom and here in person. And welcome to the first Seniors College Association of Nova Scotia public lecture outside of Halifax, here in Liverpool. It is also our first Zoom and in-person hybrid, so you are part of an experiment. Before we start, I wish to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people who have lived and cared for this land since time immemorial. My name is Susan Letson, and I am the coordinator of the Liverpool chapter, who, along with a small committee of 4, are pleased to bring SCAN's courses and lectures to our town. Now, I'm going to introduce my committee members. Can you see them out there? I'd like Betsy and Tina and Jan and Pam to stand and raise your arms. Can you be seen? These committee members are happy to answer any questions you might have about SCANs this morning. So please ask them if you want to join, pay money, volunteer, whatever. I've also been asked, to those of you who are on Zoom, to please not use Wi-Fi for this transmission. We're using Wi-Fi here at the theater. We want to keep it strong, so I've been asked to ask you not to use Wi-Fi. I also would like to recognize some guests in our audience. We're delighted to have Ann Chisholm, who's the chair of SCANs, with us this morning. I'd like to introduce the Reverend Cherry Workman. Cherry is out here. She works to alleviate hunger in our area. And I also want to recognize Mary McIntosh and Kate Bird, 2 former SCANs leaders. Do people know who you are? It's a bit of a joke, and that it's taking 5 of us to do what Mary did by herself. So anyway, Ann Chisholm wants to say a few words.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everybody. And if I just may correct something Susan said, the people on Zoom don't turn off your Wi-Fi. It's those of you who are in our audience who may have your cell phones on Wi-Fi, if you would just please not use the Wi-Fi while we're doing this, because it seems to be very unstable and might cause us to lose our presentation. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
I had a picture of everybody at home turning off. I'm actually here on behalf of the Board of Directors of SCANs to welcome you all here and to congratulate Susan and her team on the wonderful job they've been doing setting up this lecture and planning her upcoming terms of courses. It's really, really great to sort of get back in person and, as Susan says, have several people doing Mary McIntosh's job. And I want to thank Susan and her team for arranging a lecture that's so topical. I know that Sylvain is speaking in several areas, and there's a lot of interest in this topic and our food distribution system and why we're paying so much for groceries these days. So it will be fascinating. I also want to tell you that SCANs is a volunteer organization. We have 1 paid, 2.5-day-a-week employee for the whole organization across Nova Scotia. So the rest of it, everything is done by volunteers. So if you want to volunteer, we would love to have you to find you a job very easily. Our mission is actually to offer academic level, non-exam, homework courses to seniors in Nova Scotia. And we have defined seniors as somebody 50 plus, but I must say if you're 49 and you want to come, we don't have an age test, so we're fine. And the courses are for enjoyment only. Some of our instructors will sometimes, if it's somebody who's doing a writing course, they may give you something to write at home and bring back to class, but that's about as far as it goes. Our membership is $150 plus HST for a year. For that membership, you can take as many courses as you want if you're willing to travel. I know Mahone Bay has some fabulous courses planned this year. There's a great one in Chester. So the brochures are out in the entrance, and you can take a look at them. And Susan has a great one planned here. If you want, we have one on Zoom this term, so you can sit in the comfort of your own home and watch that one. And if you need more information, you want to learn more about scans, you can go to our website. The address is on here, and it's also on the brochures that you'll pick up. And before I leave, I'd like to begin by thanking both Sylvain and Costas for agreeing to do this today. I know Susan will give them a better introduction, so I'll turn the podium back to you, Susan.
And I want to say I'm a newbie to this organization in a sense, and I want to thank the other chapters, and I want to thank the Halifax chapter for their terrific support of us. You know, they've just been great in giving us resources and encouragement. So I think we really got a lot of good support and resources to make this chapter fly. As Anne said, SCAN's mission is to learn and enjoy. And in case we don't remember that, we've got a banner that reminds us of that. And it's really wonderful to hear people talk about how much they love to come out of their house, sit with like-minded people, learn something new, you know, especially as the dark days of winter and fall, you know, come upon us. It's a lovely thing to do. This fall, we're delighted to have Susan Hoover. Some of you may remember her from a previous course, who will explore with us the glory of the short story through international authors and, of course, including our own Alice Munro. And we do have brochures in the lobby to give you a lot more information as to how to join us and register. And I'm coming to the end. An information and registration session on September 22nd, which is next week, at 10 o'clock at Trinity Church, will introduce you to Susan and her course, and you can register and get more information at that time. There is also a Zoom course coming from Halifax this fall by Dr. Pierre Schmidt on medical language in Western culture. So that sounds interesting. Anyway, and now to today's program. We are so pleased that Dr. Sylvain Charlebois and Costas Halavrezos have kindly and readily agreed to make the trek to Liverpool today to present what we expect to be an informative and entertaining conversation. Sylvain is a noted researcher in food distribution and policy and director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab based at Dalhousie. He comments widely in our local media on topics relating to Canada's food system. He told me that he likes to be interviewed, so who better to do that than Costas, given his many successful years on Maritime Noon. So it is with great pleasure that I turn you over to Costas, who will moderate our program and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Scans, for inviting us, and for all of you for coming out on a beautiful morning. There are other things you could have chosen to do, but we're really glad you chose this one. Sylvain, when we talk about food, it could be anything from where it's grown, how it's grown, to the price we pay in the store. But since supply chain has entered the popular vocabulary over the past couple of years, what are the real key links in that chain that we should be aware of whenever we talk about food? Because no one part exists in isolation for the other links in that chain.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, if I may, I want to thank the community members for inviting me and give me an excuse to leave Halifax for a few hours. I actually really our family and I really enjoy this part of the province, Liverpool. We actually come and visit once in a while, so it was very easy for me to accept the invitation, and you guys do wonderful work, and frankly, I'm a sucker for community groups. In fact, I have 4 talks like this for 4 consecutive days. This is number 2. Yesterday I was with a group out of Thornhill, Ontario, and on Sunday I'm actually in Lunenburg. So I always enjoy connecting with people to talk about food because, well, as you just mentioned, COVID made a lot of people realize that the grocery store is not the food system. There's an obscure part of food systems that people, a lot of people just now realize that there's a lot of complexities. I mean, mainly you have production, you have processing, distribution, and retail, and of course you have food service. And what happened in March of 2020 really was a black swan event. Let's face it, I don't think we're ever going to see an entire economic sector shut down overnight. Restaurants represent about $100 billion worth of sales yearly. That was shut down overnight. So to me, seeing empty shelves at the grocery store was perfectly understandable and predictable. But when we started to get phone calls from reporters from different folks around the country, I quickly realized a lot of people just didn't understand what was going on. People thought that we were actually running out of food. And I said, well, if there is one last country that could run out of food, it would probably be Canada, just because of the geopolitics of food around the world. When you understand how North America works, we're in this food security bubble in North America compared to the Middle East or Europe, and unfortunately Europeans are learning that the hard way with the Ukrainian conflict. But we're pretty safe continent from a food security perspective, and so it got us to talk about food distribution from farm gate to plate. And so all of a sudden we started to talk about processing because plants were shutting down, some of them in our own province here for a variety of reasons out west. And I think 17 processing plants in total had to close for 2 weeks in the country during the height of the pandemic. And obviously it created shortages for certain products. And by the way, there are still shortages out there going on. I know why, but most people, as soon as they see an empty shelf, they think we run out of food. There's a variety of issues that are happening right now due to higher inflation. Michael Medline, the president of Sobeys yesterday, I thought he did a pretty good job explaining to shareholders and the audience or the public that things are really difficult in the grocery business, even though many people think that grocers are gouging consumers. It's been difficult for them because the market is absolutely unpredictable. So there's lots of tension in the system right now that is making things very complicated for most people involved, and so farmers, processors, and grocers as well.
Now, as you mentioned, we did see those dramatic shots of empty shelves in 2020.
Yes.
And Cargill was one of the big companies shut down production, mainly out west. But one of the things, again, that emerged because of COVID and having to look at these vulnerabilities is that Cargill is one of only 3 companies that supply 85% of the meat in Canada.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts on that degree?
Beef in particular.
Yeah. That amount of consolidation in the food business, not just in the processing, but also in the retailing.
Yep. On June 1st of this year, I was asked to testify in the Nova Scotia legislature about food security, and I was asked that question about processing. The one thing I told you, Costas, before we started, I actually believe that the Atlantic is the most vulnerable region in the country when it comes to food security, for the simple reason that we don't process much of the food we eat. We don't grow much of it. We grow a lot of food, but for other people, not for ourselves. That's one problem. The other problem is that we don't process much food in our own region. And processing, to me, is, as an economist, is such an important piece of the food system puzzle, because it anchors everything. The innovation, control, all of the things that you need in order to run a sound supply chain. You need a strong processing sector. And you're kind of alluding to what's going on in beef. It's controlled by just a few players. So there's just, if you're just one shutdown away from being in trouble. I was involved with the 2012 Brooks recall. If you remember, in 2012, you retired. You were retired then.
Maybe I'm still paying attention.
Yeah. But good, excellent. XL Foods in 2012 experienced the largest food recall in our country's history. We had to recall over 6 million kilos of beef. Many people got sick in the country. And so, because I work with the CFIA, I was involved with the investigation, and for 28 days that plant was shut down. We went through the same thing as when Cargill had to shut down in 2020 as well. And as you know, Costas, in 2020, Cargill became the center of the largest COVID outbreak in the country. You know, almost 2,000 people got sick as a result of that plant not being monitored appropriately. So,
which was the exposure of one of those vulnerabilities, which
absolutely
would not have been exposed and garnered that attention if it hadn't been.
I never visited the Cargill plant, but I did visit the Brooks plant, and both were built pretty much at the same time. And I got to tell you, I mean, in Brooks in 2012, that was 10 years ago, that plant was undercapitalized, like heavily undercapitalized. And there were a lot of things that needed to change that were just put on hold. You can see that there was a lot of priority given to different things, but not necessarily on food safety and, of course, workers in the plant. And so we were very concerned. We wrote a report for the CFIA. And then while we were writing the report, the plant was sold to GBS. There's a lot of that going on. And so with Cargill, I don't know what has happened since 2020. I don't know if they've actually invested more in the plant. My guess is that they've automated the place a lot more to basically eliminate positions, because if you understand that, if you've been to a slaughtering plant, it's paradise for a virus. COVID must have had a party there. I mean, it's very humid, very cold, and people work very closely with each other. It was a perfect when the outbreak happened, I was not surprised. But it just tells you how the industry doesn't really think strategically about processing, or our country thinks about processing in general.
Well, the other thing, I mean, as you mentioned, they hadn't been investing in it. There was probably a lot of deferred maintenance. The other thing is we do have governments who are charged with inspecting these, and we do have laws and regulations.
Yep.
What did that and any of these other closures highlight about, I don't know, the rigor or lack of rigor in government inspections, provincially or federally?
This is a question I get a lot when people are concerned about food safety, and I'm very critical to the CFIA, and even though I'm a national scientific board of the CFIA, that's why I'm actually there. They kind of want to know what Canadians
Devil's advocate.
Yeah. Well, let me ask the audience. I mean, do you know how many federal inspectors we have in this country? It's 3,400. And I bet you, and I include myself in that group, most people don't know what they do. So that's the problem. Transparency is a huge problem, and it kind of came out during COVID. Is that all of a sudden, okay, there's other stuff going on other than the grocery store, and how do we monitor risks as a country? So we got 3,400 inspectors out there. What are they doing?
Is that, do you think, a sufficient number?
That's another question I get a lot. So Bob Kingston, who's the president of the union representing inspectors, his response would be no.
More inspectors.
More inspectors. And I've always asked Bob Kingston, because I've had debates with him, so okay, so it's not enough. What is the optimal number of inspectors we need in Canada? Nobody really knows the answer. My guess, I think the starting point would be to actually allow the Canadian public to better understand what inspectors are doing, make inspectors' reports public, as it is in the US. If there are anomalies being reported after a visit, what are the steps followed to mitigate some of these anomalies, and so on and so forth. There's no follow-up. And humans are humans. Inspectors become friendly with management. So, oh, you need to repair this wall. You need to change those tools. We don't have the money this month. Can we wait for another month? No problem. You see where I'm getting? So
We saw what happened when that was going on at the Westray Mine too.
Exactly. Yeah. It's non-food, but I know exactly what happened. But you're absolutely correct. The parallel is very obvious. Yeah.
And again, there's a potential for lives actually being lost if the whole system of checking on safety is not working.
Absolutely. And so we tend to believe that we need to pour more resources, especially when it comes to food and food safety, but we don't necessarily try to understand the power or the influence of a dollar. So what happens if we spend more? What changes do occur, and how do we optimize our investments? Because the budget for the CFIA, I mean, there's over 9,000 people that work at the CFIA. I mean, it's a big organization. Their budget is over $900 million. But very few Canadians appreciate what's going on there. And I think that needs to change. If you go on the CFI's website to find any information, good luck. I hope you have the entire day, because it's very hard. I asked my RAs, my research assistants, go on their website and find out, I don't know, how many recalls have we had this year? Simple question. Takes them about 6-7 hours to get that answer. It's just not user-friendly, and that needs to change in order for Canadians to better appreciate how we're actually managing risks.
Now, we have been talking about the vulnerabilities and some things that went wrong. But again, did our experience the past few years highlight, I guess, opportunities for people who work in agriculture and the value-added food industries in this region?
Yes. I've spoken to farmers in the valley, and I mean, we have to admit ourselves that most Canadians don't want those jobs. I mean, they don't want necessarily to work on farms and in processing plants. And that's something that there's a potato farmer in the valley. She did get a lot of attention, and she was in the media quite a bit, and she invited people to send their resumes to her farm to work, and I think she received about 100 resumes. And her response to all of the applicants, okay, show up on Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock at my farm, and then we'll get some work done. Do you know how many people actually showed up out of 100? 2.
How much information did she give about the job?
Well,
wages, etc.
Of course, that she was clear in terms of expectations, wages, and everything. But I mean, I grew up on a farm myself in Quebec, where I'm from, and farming is a lot of work. I mean, it's just a lot of work. Rain or shine, you got to do the work. In horticulture, you're outside, it gets cold this time of year, you got to get out no matter what. And so, and I'm not saying that university students are lazy or anything, but it's just we're not hardwiring them to think about outside work, work for 12, 13 hours. I mean, on the farm when I was a kid, I mean, we just didn't think of hours. We just think of the task. We need to do this and that.
But this was a family farm, was it not?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. But for a farmer who has to hire people who are not members of the family, I happen to know he might be the most successful organic farmer in Nova Scotia. I don't know for sure, but he's right up there. He has a waiting list and has had waiting lists for years to work for him. He has never taken advantage of the migrant worker program because he pays really well and gives his workers benefits. Now, if your business model is predicated on, let's say, minimum wages, things like that, is it possible that's not a good business model when it comes to labor?
I guess it really depends where you sit in the food system. So, for example, if you talk to farmers and their client is Sobeys or Loblaws or Walmart, things are tight. I don't know about this organic farmer at all. And frankly, it's great.
Yep.
But organics are still remains a marginal market. And there's always a premium you pay at the grocery store. So margins there's more wiggle room, if you will. Nowadays...
I don't need, if I may, most of the stuff I see is available in farmers markets at competitive prices with the
I'm sure.
the markets. And he also supplies wholesale to restaurants and food things too. So it's a big operation. But anyway.
Yeah. The reality is that 85% of all the food we buy are from Loblaws, Empire, Sobeys, Metro, Walmart, and Costco. That's the reality, and they run the show right now. I mean, they dictate exactly what we buy, how much we pay for, etc. And because when you understand the political economy of food distribution, that's really where the power lies. So farmers are price takers, first and foremost. So if you're vertically integrated as a farmer, you're in better control. If you process your own food, you're in control as well, which is great. So it allows you to go to farmers market and basically connect with the public and set the price you want for your product. Unfortunately, most farmers don't have that luxury. They're price takers. So they grow and they take the best price possible. In Nova Scotia, again, going back to our province, when you look at data from Statistics Canada, here's another alarming data. And the Nova Scotia's Farmers Federation of Agriculture, Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, didn't know this, but of all provinces in Canada, this is where we've actually lost the most farms as a percentage, 28% in the last 3 years. So we're losing a lot of farms. And that's an indicator. Now, is that a problem? Yes or no? Some people, I would say yes, because we're not necessarily... I'm concerned about our province because we live in Halifax. Halifax is booming.
Oh, Dartmouth, say it out loud.
Dartmouth.
Oh, no, we both live in Dartmouth.
Yeah, and Dartmouth is a lovely place. We love it. We've been there for several years now. And Dartmouth and Halifax, the HRM is booming. I mean, you have cranes everywhere, jobs. But as soon as you leave Halifax, within half an hour, you can start seeing, you can feel the poverty in some places. And I'm very concerned about rural Nova Scotia in particular. And the best way to create wealth in rural Nova Scotia is with agri-food, agriculture. So to me, the 28% is an alarming piece of information, because I'm not sure the government, I said that to the Premier, I'm not sure we take food security or our regions very seriously. I just don't see the evidence. Unlike other provinces, even PEI does a better job, I think, with its Canada's Food Island strategy. It's an amazing strategy. Quebec is focusing more on food autonomy. Foodland Ontario is doing very well. Even Alberta now, of all provinces, have a buy local strategy. Alberta, you know? So we got to get going here.
Yeah. Again, when we're looking at anything in the topic of farming gate to the plate, the federal government sets food policy. And in 2019, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada set these two goals. One, that all people in Canada are able to access a sufficient amount of safe, nutritious, and culturally diverse food. Two, Canada's food system is resilient and innovative, sustains our environment, and supports our economy. Now, depending on how closely you read that, I actually count 7 or 8 things. But one thing that's not mentioned at all is affordability.
Yes.
And everybody's hyper-conscious of that these days. What about the affordability of that safe, nutritious, and culturally diverse food? We know there are always disruptions, and I hope they're transient. In this case, you know, the pandemic and even the war in Ukraine can drive prices up.
Yeah.
But when you look at long-term trends, and I know you've been looking at trends for a long time, what's been building up there, grinding away in the whole food chain, supply chain, over the years, with things that are just gently adding to the cost of food all the time?
If I may, I just wanted to take a step back and then I'll answer your question, which is a really important one. The notion of food security, and both you and I talked about that. I think
it's to many people.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of lay out what it actually means, and then unpack that, and then go to your question, if I may. What is food security? Well, food security to me, and it can be defined in many different ways, but to me, there are 3 fundamental access to food security. There's obviously food access. That's an important one. If you don't have access to food, then you're in trouble, and that's kind of what Ukraine has done for a lot of people. You see, Ukraine, when you look at the calorific output of Ukraine's agriculture, it has the capacity to feed about 400 million people every year. That's more than the U.S. So you said U.S.'s population. And right now, Ukraine's agriculture is operating at about 50%. So if you're good at math, that's a deficit of 200 million people right there. And they do export a lot of wheat, and so does Russia. That's 25% of exports. And wheat is a big one because wheat accounts for about 15% of all calories eaten on Earth. So if wheat is affected, you'll have famine. And that's what's coming, unfortunately, in the Middle East, parts of the Middle East, Northeast Africa, just because of what happened in February, unfortunately. So access. And of course, we saw ships leaving Ukrainian ports, which is a good thing. But we barely saw. I think we're up to about 20 vessels now, and we needed 700 by the end of September. So I don't think we're going to get there. There's a lot of grains that need to be moved, but it's not moving. So access is a critical component to food security. The second component to food security is food safety. Now, food safety will vary depending where you are around the world, but it's not because I'm on the board of the CFIA, but I must say, and as a lab, we actually benchmark Canada's performance with other countries. Canada is a top-tier country when it comes to food safety. Our food is very safe compared to other parts of the world. I don't know how you feel, but I mean, our practices are pretty strong, and our record is very, very strong as well. So when you travel around the world, you talk about some of the things that are happening. Some countries actually come to Canada to learn how we're doing things. But we do have the luxury of a cold climate in the winter, kills bugs, okay? Like southern US, things are more complicated food safety-wise because of the weather. And secondly, we have space, plenty of space. For example, when the avian flu hits, kills our birds, well, we have so much space here, it's easy to contain an outbreak. In other parts of the world, like Asia, it's much more difficult because they just don't have the space. So food safety is another component to food security. And the last component is affordability. If your prices are not affordable, you're still not resolving anything. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now in Canada. Food affordability is being challenged because of inflation. And why is inflation a problem? I'm getting to your question.
I love context.
I'm an academic, so I have to define things for a living. Affordability, and this is where Canada does not rank well, by the way. We're 24th in the world, according to the UN, which is not great, you know. And the reason why affordability has become an issue in Canada is one, I mean, climate change is a reality. It's impacting a lot of things. It makes things unpredictable. Last year was a disaster. Our harvest was a complete disaster. We had droughts, and this year it's Europe's time. Asia as well was hit by droughts. It's horrible. Mother Nature will always have this thing to say when it comes to agriculture. And so we publish Canada's Food Price Report every December, and the wild card for us every year is what's going to happen with climate change. What's going to happen with the weather? Which country is going to be hit hardest? We didn't expect Ukraine, unfortunately. I guess well, you can argue that climate change is a human-induced phenomena, but Ukraine was obviously a human-induced phenomena. And so that really is a contributing factor to our inflation for sure. We all pay for climate change every time we eat. There's no doubt in my mind. Now the coefficient and everything, we're still working on that, but we don't know. The other factor are geopolitics. We're always an embargo away from seeing prices skyrocket. We're always an invasion away from seeing prices skyrocket, which is exactly what happened. Viruses, pandemics will impact also food prices. And of course, COVID was a worldwide outbreak, it was a worldwide phenomena. But I mean, we've had Ebola and other pandemics before that have impacted our food systems in the past. And finally, currency wars. Currency wars are a big one. We've been lucky in the last few years. Our dollar, you know, it's at about 75 cents versus the greenback. It's been a non-story for the last 3 years, but I'm concerned now. I want to scare you, but I'm a little bit, because interest rates are going up, right? And there's a bit of a, so our people are saying, oh, we're going to pay more for our markets, which is true, and it's impacting our ability to feed ourselves. It's very true. But my biggest concern is over the long term, over the next 12 months to 24 months, we may see countries trying to beat other countries in terms of defending their own currency. That's kind of what's going on right now, and nobody's talking about this. And that's why our looting is starting to, if you look at the last week or so, our looting is starting to weaken. And that concerns me because we import a lot of food, especially in the winter. You remember that cauliflower crisis we had a few years ago? currency. That's exactly what happened. And so we're watching that dollar very closely because there's a bit of a, and all central banks are just trying to defend their own currency to essentially protect their economy.
Well, speaking of Canada's position in the global food economy, in his accession speech last Saturday night, the new leader of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Who won?
Just tuned out on the weekend. On the weekend, he tunes out.
And by the way, Aaron O'Toole, I went to school with him.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, I went to school. Yeah. He's a great guy, so I felt really bad for him. Politics are politics. What can I say? But he's a good. I wouldn't say he's a good friend, but he's a good guy, and it's unfortunate what happened to him. But politics are politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway, the guy who won said he would repatriate food production by standing with our farmers here at home.
Yes.
Now, that can mean many things to many people. He got a big round of applause and cheers in the auditorium among the party faithful. But when you look at the bigger picture, what does that mean to you? Repatriate food production.
I don't know. By the way, try to say Pierre Poilievre 10 times in a row. I'm a francophone.
Yeah.
So, anyways, congratulations to Mr. Poilievre. And I've actually had the pleasure to talk to Mr. Poilievre a couple of times on what topic? Inflation. And I did tell him, that he needs to be careful with the just inflation because it is a worldwide phenomenon. I know Canadians are struggling with food prices, but the food inflation rate in the U.S. is 13.5%, which is 4% more than us. Europe is the same thing. Britain is going through the same thing. This is not just Canada. So I just wanted to put it out there. In terms of, I think what Mr. Poilievre means is that we want to take control. We want to become more autonomous from a production perspective. And when it comes to processing, going back to processing, if you control processing as a country, it gets much easier to support farmers. Much easier. When you have farmers shipping stuff overseas, and like right now, did you guys know that Canada is the largest mustard seed producer in the world? Good for you! Excellent!
Lentils too, I believe.
That's right! But we export 95% of pulses that we produce. 95%. But mustard, it's incredible, because I started my career in Saskatchewan, and we ship mustard to the US, and we buy it back in a bottle 20 times the price. Like, how does that work? And I think people are starting to understand the economics of being vulnerable from a food processing perspective. But there's been some good things happening, to be honest. I actually feel quite confident because, first of all, the federal government recently created these super clusters. We have one at Dal called the Ocean Frontier Institute. There's also one in Regina, Saskatchewan, where I used to live. They have a Proteins Industries Canada super cluster. And the super cluster there, its role is to support innovation, get companies to invest. They're basically PPPs. So in the last 5 years, and it hasn't been talked about too much in the media, but we've seen companies like Rocket out of Europe, Nestle, you may have heard of Nestle, they've all been invested in Canada, Lovingly, Merit Foods, all these companies have invested in the prairies to process food in our own backyard. Kraft Heinz just decided to build a new plant in Montreal to make ketchup, and they closed the plant in Leamington in 2013. Kellogg's is thinking about building. You see, I think what's going on, and I know that Mr. Poilievre is against the carbon tax and any measures to mitigate climate change, but for many years, and this is why Canada lost its way in processing, for many years companies saw global food supply chains like water on the table. You know, when you put water on the table, if I put water on this table, where will the water go?
Find out whether the table is level or not.
That's right. It will go to the lowest point of the table and will probably reach the floor. So companies like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, you name it, they've always looked at the economics of food supply chains like water on the table. Where's the cheapest place in the world where I can actually buy this, manufacture that, package this, ship that? That was easy. So Malaysia, Indonesia, China, Chile. So it didn't matter where it went, it was the cheapest. But now, with a carbon market, when you're actually pricing carbon, it changes everything. All of a sudden, companies are saying, okay, whoa, if I make my cornflakes in Malaysia and ship those boxes back to Canada to feed Canadians, that's going to cost money now. So maybe we should start, servicing different markets differently. I think there's a lot of that going on in boardrooms right now. And that's why I'm not necessarily against the carbon tax, because I think it's forcing companies to think differently about food markets in general. The problem with the carbon tax is that we haven't really properly assessed how food affordability will be impacted by the carbon tax. I've spoken to the Minister of Agriculture in Ottawa about this, and they haven't really. We're actually slowly marching towards a carbon tax of $170 per metric ton by 2030. We're at 60 now. That's a lot of money, and so farmers, processors, everyone in the food chain are wondering how will that impact the prices of food that we see at the grocery store. And nobody has the answer. And that's an answer we need to get to. So you can appreciate what we're doing to reduce gas emissions as much as possible. And I think we need to do things as quickly as possible. But at the same time, we also need to understand what's at stake here.
I only have one more question for you, because we're going to wrap up this portion of the morning, and following that, there's going to be a 15-minute break. Everybody can go out to the lobby. There is coffee and tea. And then when you come back in, if you don't have other things to do, we're going to have the microphone available if you want to ask some questions of Sylvain. But the one I'm going to ask you is, I couldn't help but notice, reading and listening to you over the years, that you've been very critical of marketing boards, different levels. I'm going to pick. In 30 seconds. No. I want to ask you, what's your beef with dairy farmers? I have lots of time to think.
No, I appreciate the question. It's a fair question. First of all, I'm concerned about dairy farming, not dairy farmers. Actually, I see dairy farmers as victims. And it doesn't come out because dairy farmers are proud and they don't necessarily, by the way, I used to work and live on a dairy farm. Remember I said that? So, of course, my father, just a quick story, my father actually sold his quotas in 1986, went back to school, became a lawyer. Condo law, downtown Montreal. True story. I told him, you should write a book about this, But I have a lot of respect for dairy farmers. Boards, not so much. Why? Because when you understand the system, boards control everything. I know dairy farmers are very concerned about how powerful boards have become. The dairy farmers of Canada have millions and millions of dollars to spend to convince you and I to drink more milk and eat more cheese, which is great, I mean, high quality products, but it's all about boards. Farmers have actually lost a lot of power over the years. Let me give you an example. This year, speaking of food affordability, this year, the Canadian Dairy Commission decided to increase farm gate milk prices by 8.4% in February, and another hike happened just a few weeks ago on September 1st.
And the reasons given were?
Reasons given were inflation, cost to produce milk is higher. However, I have friends in dairy processing, and I got a hold of a document from the CDC. The Canadian Dairy Commission, by the way, is a Crown corporation we all own. It's the government of Canada, and not transparent at all. So when they say it's going to cost you, it's costing more to produce milk, I always say, where's the data? I'd like to see the data. And I was, well, it's confidential, we can't really share anything. And I know why they say that, because they can come up with the numbers they want in accordance to what the Dairy Farmers of Canada want. But I did get a hold of a copy of a study showing, and so the CDC, what they do is that they actually survey about 250 dairy farmers around the country and ask them about, how much you pay for feeding animals, heating your barn, and how much does it cost to produce milk. And they come up with a price. They come up with a price per hectoliter. Well, in that report I got, which was circulated with media, it showed that between 2020 and 2021, the cost to produce milk dropped in Canada by 1%. It didn't go up. So in other words, the 8.4% was unjustified. And what I was getting to is this interference of the boards with the government. The CDC and the DFC are one, and that's a problem. The CDC is there to protect the interest of the public, but not anymore. It really is there, and there's about 85 people that worked at the CDC, not the CBC, the CDC. The CDC is amazingly influenced by Dairy Farmers of Canada in particular. And farmers have no say. I mean, they don't know about this. They think this won't. So east of Toronto, you do have smaller farms, and they do want more. Who doesn't want more money for their product? So they're not going to complain. I understand that. But my concern about what's happening right now with the Canadian Dairy Commission and the Dairy Farmers of Canada is that they're pricing dairy products out of the market. We actually did a study recently comparing dairy alternatives with milk, and dairy alternatives are much cheaper now. So if families are having a hard time buying milk, they're going to start, drinking almond milk or soy milk, even though it's not the same thing. They just can't afford milk.
Or pop.
Or pop, yeah. So my concern about dairy farming is that, so right now we have about 9,580 dairy farms in Canada. In 1970 we had 45,000. Okay? If we continue on this path, we could lose half of our farms in Canada by 2030. So we could go down to 5,000. And if you look at Nova Scotia in particular, and this is why this is a really critical issue. In 1980, Nova Scotia had 800 dairy farms in our province, 4 processing plants. We're down to 1 processing plant in Bedford, and we have 150 dairy farms left. So that's the model we want? I don't know.
I mean, again, we're going to wrap it up, but I wonder, we still have the same number of cows. Is it, or are we just talking about consolidation? There aren't the small farms, there are just a few very large farms.
The size have actually grown a little, and genetics is better, so cows are producing more per, so we all know that. But my concern is that all the butter we eat in this province, the yogurt, the sour cream, all the stuff we love, the milk is put in a truck outside the province to Quebec, processed, and truck back. Is that sustainable? I mean, I would love to see a project where we can process our own butter, do our own stuff right here. Who wouldn't want a product from Nova Scotia? Nova Scotia, when I go to Toronto and talk to folks in Toronto in the food business, they love Nova Scotia. They want our wines, they want our products, but it's not accessible, it's not there. So we need to become more strategic. So I'm really glad that our province is thinking about Nova Scotia local. I think that's a great starting point. And imagine being incentivized to buy local as a consumer, and you can get points, a rebate when you renew your license plate or your driver's license. That, I wish I would have thought of that. It's a great idea.
Because I can think of at least 3 buy local campaigns over the past 30-odd years in the region, either provincially or regionally.
But when you go to the store,
yeah.
I go, and I said that to Perenia and the Department of Agriculture, when I go to Sobeys in Dartmouth, I see Nova Scotia local, and underneath there's products from the U.S. There's it's not disciplined, it's not organized.
We didn't even get into labeling, but I'm going to wrap it up here because we're going to have that break. Again, tea or coffee with good, pure Canadian milk in the lobby right now. If you could come back in about 15 minutes, that would be great. And I'd like to hear your questions because there are many more. Thank you.
I'll be there. So did you have surgery on your hand? I still breathe. How is it? It's good. It's amazing. Good. Good. First few days were kind of weird. Yeah. That's right. We both are. Figuring that out is and it takes a long time to cook. How are you? Like 6 hours, and you gotta look and sit over.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about, you said, I have time, seafood was on it. And then that at least, I mean, really close, but I mean, I have done that at home, like I have.
And I even thought of it today instead of days. I was gonna do like maybe hotel days. Maybe there's a lot of great now. All the big things we have.
Okay, well, I should be there Monday at 2.
Yep, sounds good. I think it's working. Oh, yes, I am considerably less stressed now.
They're happy. Good. They want to come back.
And it works smooth.
But he really likes the stage. They like the feeling of it all.
There are 100 people online.
Great show. They're really good.
There's
Really
100 people online.
good. Wow.
This is not a bad thing.
I think you've done a really good job. This is a good topic. Yeah, I just, Stu doesn't let go either.
Well, and Sylvain really likes this area.
Oh yeah. I think it's marvelous. Marvelous. I think this last little bit about the milk sparkling board, that should get me the milk. How we're not processing milk. We ship all our milk to Quebec to process it. The only one we have here is Scottsburg. Yeah. Anyway.
My grandfather has a dairy farm.
Oh my, okay.
My uncle sold the quota. More money in a year than I've ever had in my whole life.
We won't go there.
No.
It's great though. You're doing a good job.
So far? What's that? Oh, good for you. Good for you. Can I get you anything? Yes. A little sudden boost. No drink?
Oh, yeah.
Is it all working?
That's terrific.
And they didn't tune out.
Right. It's very interesting.
I just repositioned the camera a little bit.
Right.
I'm trying to focus it a little bit.
I must tell Susan, isn't that great? So, and it seems to be working okay.
Left it running.
Yes.
Don't turn it off. Don't mess with it.
But I did move the camera. Try to focus it.
As you talk to Bill at home.
I miss before they started. And I couldn't do it well. I was thinking, what do I do?
That's fabulous, Kate.
Ford and the other. They're mixed. Some of them are on both boards.
And I think for our first one here, with the small thing, yes, turn out a cable on the line. So we're holding them. Yes, that's great. Years ago, my husband and I worked, we traveled around the United States, and we spent a month in Arizona, Mexico, California border, huge army there. And every night they were he had us himself. Every night, they worked in the fields all day, the stuff went, never left the field. To the legislature. Every night they used to shut down the track. took off, and the lead stream went straight through. And that's how we got back to this course. So then that was in January, February. May, and somebody went and asked the seller, went and asked the guy, where's the celery? He said, well, for some reason, this time I don't get the celery. I said, I know, it's too hot to market. And the Canadian celery hasn't come on the market. So there's a period of time there. It's fascinating business. Exactly, almost my salary. Yeah. You're making a potato salad for us. Because I was looking I love it. I found that just me and one therapist and three very That's a good idea. My nephew, I stopped doing it because I'm vegetarian and they didn't die now. Well, I got frustrated with the variety. I got so hard to do. And plus I'm going to be a little older.
Where's the lecture started? It's already finished. We just had the first part. This is intuition.
Yes.
On the food system, right? Yes. Thank you very much. Tuesday. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, yes, that would be the next step. I really think there's a big business in doing that, you know, doing all car crashes. It's no more or less from the grocery store, so it's affordable. No, it's not. I found that, you know, when I was using it, because I got 3 meals, so I think I got 2 or 3 meals. And then I got, you know, I usually eat it. I same thing, 3 days in a row, you know. So I need it for lunch or supper, you know, and I don't like it. I still do it. It's the only way. And they said it's a lovely picture, but it shouldn't look like it. What's to do next?
I said, you know, they get on these, they shut down all the boards they were Republican. That's it.
We got up and stood up in the dark.
Well, I was late.
Oh, were you?
It was quarter after 10. I'm like, oh, shit, I better anyway. So what time was your reservation?
12:30.
Oh,
Yeah.
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 Man, he really knows this stuff, doesn't he?
Not a note.
I know.
Piece of paper.
I know. She's still in it.
Amazing. And a really nice man.
Oh, I could listen to him forever.
Just going to tell you that this camera is still on. So if you don't want to be, well, I don't want to switch it off because it will cut off the stream. I just was very telling you that.
Get out of the way of the camera, Jan. Hi. It's a hi.
Didn't even notice it there. Thank you, Kate. I mean, it's not picking up any sound.
That's not the point. I'm going over and sit on. Where are you sitting, Janet? Have you got room for me? Here you were.
Yes.
Okay, let's go sit down.
Yes.
Beautiful place. Yeah. Where are you?
He was dead.
I did it.
I don't know. My stress levels.
Oh, good. Oh, my goodness. Susan put the mic down on the floor there.
So
That was the one I was just going to, I'm doing like a 1 minute thing.
just an introduction. Celeste, like an introduction. How are you? So are they going to talk again?
They're going back to
Yes,
take questions.
So it's just
because of the, I knew it was complex, so I didn't.
I'll put the microphone back there. Because that's
Like there's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet.
But you know, I do think.
I literally am close. It was a few so whatever's easiest, I just went to tap that and I thought, oh, that's all.
Oh, it's, yeah, they're all here.
We came down and knew that.
I've never looked that way. Move over another one. They may need to start it. But yeah.
Well, I think the idea of the process is part of what I just went through.
That's what you're supposed to be.
That we send things
Go
out.
back, bring it back, bring it back.
And the mustard seed. I mean, going up, it's like everybody.
Number 5, that's right. And so it's back on this. Yeah, that's a little there.
You going down here or not?
Yeah.
Regular set of
And there's a few local.
Chester people are allowed. I was wondering if the Chester people were allowed. I'm good. How are you?
It's good to see you.
We all live here. No, I live in the family. I was thinking I haven't been to but I really I kind of went, you're there. Yeah, okay. I'm with Stan and we're not doing any of this at the moment, but we're going to. And did you yeah. Second one. God really well, I was just saying to Sue, the one thing I really I love that aspect of life. Okay, well, it's not a I understood that. Yes. No, I went to Aerosmith. And a lot of people been cheese. Yeah. So they dropped there and then yeah, that's right. Well, it worked the same way as music. All I was like, and I could fly.
That's the way we go.
They don't even go to
yeah. It was hilarious. Everybody'd stop. Farmers and goats. Your stuff at the end.
I feel like I should have a guitar here to accompany you.
It feels,
Do you croon?
there's some coziness here. I really enjoy this setup. Congratulations, yeah.
All right.
It's very cozy.
Now you've figured out already what's to be done. If you have a question, just come forward and ask your question.
Well, I have a question. And I've been involved in community work for more years than I care to admit. My question is, I agree with you about the private boards. And what I'd like to know is, how does one go about getting rid of the, quote, political private boards? They've done away with so many of our private boards. Community service agencies, hospital agencies, are just two examples where private boards have been taken out of the community. There's no community import anymore. We need to start doing production in our own province. And if that costs money, okay. Let the government support the communities in doing their own work, because that way it saves costs for transportation back and forth. There's no reason why we should be exporting our goods to be produced somewhere else and then buy them back. That doesn't make sense to me. But how do you turn that around when politics is involved?
So in the absence of community boards like the ones you've been involved with, who's driving the policy, I guess?
Well, I mean, it boils down to civil engagement and, of course, transparency. I teach food policy at Dow to graduate students. It's an open elective, and I teach to engineers, medical students, future lawyers. It's just a great class, and I think we've all come to realize that social media is a very powerful tool. If boards tend not to be transparent, tend to control information, and this is kind of what we're seeing with dairy, by the way, with boards, not farmers, boards. You got social media to break things up, and frankly, with some issues, we've been able to use social media to our advantage. And if boards don't really respond, citizens will make a note of it. And I think that's been a bit of a game changer. I see it in policy. I mean, for example, Health Canada wanted to label our meat as having too much fat. I don't know if you saw this. Our lab was in the middle of this campaign called No Label on Our Beef. You see, Ottawa wanted to come forward with a front of package labeling policy, which I actually support. I think it's a great idea. People don't have time to read labels at the grocery store. They want to know what they're buying. So the idea of the policy is to actually slap on the front of a package logos that will tell you if that product has too much sodium, sugar, or fat. Fair enough. And frankly, what we've seen around the world, our governments wanting to do that to entice industry to offer healthier products. Who's against that? Of course, we want healthier products at the grocery store. But Health Canada had this brilliant idea of labeling single ingredient products like meat. So if your beef product, or you would have gone to the meat counter, you would have seen ground meat with a label saying it's too much fat unless it's extra lean. But extra lean is more expensive. And who would want to sell meat products with a label saying there's too much fat? Nobody. So you're basically, Health Canada was going to tell grocers, stop selling more affordable meat, essentially. And so we were contacted by the Canadian Meat Council, I think it was in February, and they told us about what was going on. And we started a campaign, which led to this huge pushback, collective pushback against Health Canada, because nothing was public. Nothing was public. We made it a public issue. People cared. And on June 30th, the Minister of Health went to the grocery store in Ottawa to announce the front of package labeling, exempting single ingredient products. So we won. We won because of social media. So I am a big believer in democracy. And city councils, political units, no matter if you are out there to serve the public, you got to be transparent. You got to engage with the public as much as possible.
But when private boards are controlled by the government, it doesn't work. And that's a lot. I mean, we've got a hospital here in Liverpool because of a group of private citizens who stood up to the government when they wanted to do away with boards, and they pulled the money out and made a private group. And now we have a Queens County Foundation, Hospital Foundation. We would have lost our hospital if it hadn't been for those half a dozen men. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Good model.
The government steps in, they shut down private agencies, and they control it. And that's political, and all those people that are on those committees care about is their own interests. They don't care about what happens in the public.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Provocative question. Someone else, perhaps. Here we go. Hello.
Hi. In, I believe, the dirty 30s, there was a priest in Nova Scotia called Father Cody who organized the farmers and the fishermen into various cooperatives. These cooperatives seem to have disappeared. I mean, Scotian Gold, I believe, was a cooperative from farmers to processing. Our milk producers were in a cooperative, Farmers Dairy. You were speaking about an organic farmer who paid benefits. Surely if small farmers were in a cooperative, then they could afford a benefit program as a cooperative. Now the Cody Institute teaches cooperatives all over the third world, but where are the cooperatives in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, the irony is not lost on me.
But I have another observation. I buy most of my meat from the farmer's market, and frequently what I want to buy isn't available because these small farmers can't get space at licensed butchers. Is that part of our processing dilemma?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That's a perfect example. When you don't process, it's much harder to service a market and be in control of your product. And that's another good example. The cooperative situation is a bit ironic and sad. I'm a big believer in the cooperative movement. After all, I am from Quebec, and cooperatives are huge in Quebec, as you probably know. But for some reason in English Canada, they came and then they left. They disappeared. And not just in the Atlantic, out west it's the same thing. And I think we need to revisit cooperatives. So since we've started, you and I, Costas, we've been talking about major issues like climate change, major disruptions in the market. Well, when you start reading the science behind cooperatives tend to do very well in uncertain times. When things fluctuate, when things really go, right, cooperatives tend to manage risk very differently, and they tend to do much better. And I absolutely agree. I think we need to revisit that model. It's a good business model for agriculture. It's a good business model to support farmers, and because they take ownership of the chain, of the value chain, which is really, really critical.
Well, especially when you were saying earlier, you know, under the current circumstances and regime, they are price takers.
Yep.
And
they will always. And so when farmers, I was actually meeting with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association a few weeks ago, and they always complain about prices at the grocery store because they see what they get, and I know what they get. You can go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange website and you'll have a good idea of what they get. So they're getting less for their beef while beef prices have gone up 19% since January. How does that work? So they always say, Sylvain, it's not fair. Of course it's not fair. You're a price taker. So what do? Well, vertically integrate. And if you want to vertically integrate, well, cooperatives are a good way to do it. So since then, we've been working on a study to actually get the financing to start a salting plant in the Saskatoon area. And so that's the kind of thing we're seeing more. So there is this awareness, I think, Costas, that is there that wasn't there just a few years ago. I think people recognize the importance of all the connections that we need in order to better service the consumer. A consumer that wants healthy products, accessible products, affordable products, local products. All of a sudden, really, there's more movement in that direction. And as a lab, we've worked with 7 provinces in the last 3 years on food autonomy, food security issues. Not with Nova Scotia. Until 5 months ago, that all changed. Now we actually are working with the province on the Nova Scotia Local, which is awesome. And another project on urban gardening. Yeah, urban agriculture, which is another really fascinating movement. And so we've been supporting the government, Nova Scotia Health, in developing a new policy for urban agriculture.
How's it going, Mayor? In Liverpool, urban gardening.
You have a very interesting way to get people to ask questions.
She's a plant. She's a plant.
People on the spot. I just want to say thank you, and thank you to SCANS, because this idea of public lectures is wonderful. I'm unaware of a present urban garden in Liverpool. I know many years ago there had been one. I do know that in Port Medway there is a small community garden. It has a greenhouse, small crops, probably 8-10 people sort of maintain it. I grew up in a family that always supplemented its food. So my parents, my father, fished, hunted deer, did those types of things. As children, we had large vegetable gardens where we picked peas by the wheelbarrow full. And I don't think my mother ever bought our winter food. I'm a firm believer that here in Queens County, we can be growing food. And you look at the innovations in food production. Greenhouses are set in the sides of hills to lessen the heat costs. We have fresh water. We can make soil from seaweed. It's difficult to convince the people I work with that that's a good direction for economic development. So, Sylvain, I'm going to be talking to you about those incentives to make the counterparts that I work with understand that that is a good industry for Queens. I've always said if our Department of Health really wanted to make people healthy, it would make them go work on a farm. My nephew and niece in the valley always made lucrative monies as young school kids, picking apples, working, but it's hard physical work. And many of our young people simply cannot physically do that work. People have become too sedentary. Working outdoors, as you stated, encouraging people to work outdoors. So my hope is that we can find ways to encourage people to garden. Many, many years ago, I worked with Dirk Van Loon in rural delivery, and the Department of Agriculture had a program whereby the Department of Agriculture would actually come to any community in Nova Scotia. It would meet with people, it would soil test their land, it would tell them what to grow, how to grow it. Unfortunately, that program was very low subscribed to, but people need help to learn and educate and know how to grow, how easy it is to grow. I know people that are just overflowing with tomatoes this year, and what a year for garlic and beans, and I still garden. I put a small garden in Port Medway, and it's amazing how much food a person can produce out of a small plot. So somehow we need to bring all that back in some enticing way to make people realize that a person can grow food. And here in Queens, we're like a 7C climate. So, we have high frost risk inland, but not so on our coast.
Yeah. Sylvain?
So.
Great points. I'll tell you why you're having a problem or you're challenged by convincing your colleagues. So we survey Canadians all the time on a variety of issues, and we did survey Canadians a while back on local foods, the willingness to buy local, and how they define local. And this came up with the province a few weeks ago when we met and started to work on NS Local. My first question was to the province, so how do you define local? What's, like in the policy, where's the definition? And they said, well, we don't know. So we surveyed Canadians and Nova Scotians. I would say right now in this province, 60% of consumers believe that if there is a maple leaf on the product, it's local. But when you go to Ontario, if you're from Durham region, that's local. If you're Wellington, that's local. In BC, if you're from the Fraser, that's local. If you're from the island of Vancouver, that's local. If you're on the island of Vancouver, but you're buying a product from Fraser, that's not local. So over the years, with many campaigns, successful campaigns, I'm being critical of campaigns that we've seen here. I don't think they've been very successful. There's been this implicit consensus in terms of what local action means. And this is something we need to do here in this province. In Quebec, they actually have a certification program for local foods. They've actually not only built a consensus, they've actually institutionalized it. For example, and this is a bit controversial, there's a Kraft Heinz plant in Montreal making peanut butter. Now, if you love Kraft Heinz peanut butter, it comes from Montreal, okay? But if you live in Quebec and you buy Kraft Heinz peanut butter, that's local. So some people may say, well, it's a multinational, that's not local. But some people disagree with that, but it is certified Aliments Québec. So they've created this consensus, implicit consensus. What is local and what is not? We need to work on that here in this province. What is local? Does it mean an ingredient from Nova Scotia? Does it mean when it's processed in Nova Scotia? If you ship milk over to Quebec and buy it back, is that local? So what is local? So we need to agree on that. And then after that, you start building a campaign and incentivizing consumer, which is great, and move on. I don't think we've actually agreed in this province in terms of what actually local means. And that's why there's a lot of people that are hard to convince. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is my June visit to the legislature, which was really eye-opening. I've testified in Parliament in Ottawa several times, in different provinces. It was my first time in Nova Scotia. So here I was with Feed Nova Scotia, Nourish Nova Scotia, some great organizations we have in this province doing some great work. The Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture was there. Then I looked around, and nobody was there to talk about processing. Nobody was there to talk about food service and restaurants. Nobody was there to talk about retail, independent retailing and major grocers. Nobody was there. They weren't invited. And all of a sudden, I was listening to questions coming from our elected officials, and all questions related to processing and distribution were all given to Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture. And they're there to represent farmers. They do great work, but they represent farmers. They don't represent the rest of the chain. And so for 2 hours I was sitting there, and it got really frustrating because all I was hearing was, let's continue to do the same thing but with more money. And then and I encourage you to go back to it because it was all recorded. At the end, the chair asked me, Dr. Charlebois, do you have anything to say before we leave? And then I said, yes, I do. And that's when I basically said, listen, I see zero evidence that this province is taking food security seriously. Zero. Zero. If I look around the country, we're way behind. We have a lot of work to do. And all I'm hearing right now is to continue to do the same things. And what you're advocating for your own city and your own region is change. And the way we see food, the way we perceive food, and the way we empower food to grow our economy. Perfect. We're far from there. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And after my testimony, the Chronicle Herald called me. There were a lot of MLAs in the room. I must give credit to the NDP leader on that one, because she's the only one who got what I was saying. Because she did respond, and she responded positively, and she was listening. She wasn't a leader then, she's not a leader, but I could tell that she got it. And then the Chronicle Herald called and did a full feature on food security in our province, which was really, we need to be honest with ourselves. We're in trouble. We're in trouble. We're always a crisis away, and that's why we're so far away from Montreal. We're always one crisis away from seeing prices skyrocket in our province. And the stuff we get compared to Montreal is crap. We get leftovers from Quebec and Ontario.
I still remember when I moved to Quebec City from St. John, New Brunswick, I thought, oh, this is where the chain stops. The trucks don't go any further than here. I was amazed. I had never seen produce of that quality before.
That was
40 years ago.
I have a planned meeting with our MLA today on aquaculture, and I'm going to take a seat, but I want to ask you your opinion on aquaculture, especially open pen fish farming. That's it. Because do you see that as food security?
So, I'm
not
not an
talking
expert.
oysters and mussels.
Well, it is very much about food security if we wanted to. That's one thing. I'm not an aquaculture expert. I work with Stephanie Colombo, who's a dear friend of mine. She is an expert in aquaculture, and we publish together. But I know it's a controversial topic in Nova Scotia. But I do believe, and we had a question about transparency and the lack of transparency. I can tell you, I think right now we're looking at an industry that is not very transparent.
Yeah.
It's not. One quick story. My wife and I, with our kids, we moved to Halifax. So we're in our house. I think it was the second weekend we were here. let's go to the Seaport Market in Halifax and buy some great fish and seafood products from Nova Scotia. Eh? So we go to the Seaport Market, beautiful place, open, lots of light, great products. And after about an hour, we said, where's the seafood? The water's right there. Where's the seafood? And there was none. There was none, except for a lobster roll vendor, like on one corner. You've been there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then I'd start, because the fishery industry is not an industry I know very well. I've always been more of a land-based kind of person. Because of my background and the research we've done, I'm starting to look at aquaculture very seriously, and I do see issues. You were talking about a few companies controlling.
Our neighbors in New Brunswick are the 900-pound gorilla.
And let me tell you, so Russia. Russia invades Ukraine. Days later, you saw many companies exit Russia. McDonald's, Starbucks, McCain, you know. Where's Cook? Still in Russia. Still in Russia because it's under the radar. They don't have a brand. They're not exposed. McCain, within days, they had to make a statement in terms of what they want. Burger King, same thing. Burger King is a Canadian company, by the way, owned by RBI, which is out of Oakville. I mean, all of these things, as soon as you're exposed to the public, you owe answers. But I haven't felt that industry, fisheries, have actually felt that they owed answers to the public. And I think they owe answers to the public.
There is a fishmonger at the brewery market in Halifax, by the way.
Is there?
Just throw that out.
Okay, good to know.
Yes.
Earlier you were talking about the impact of Ukraine and not being able to feed a lot of people. I think you talked about 50% of the grain is getting out of the ports and so on. What does that mean for Canadian farmers? How can we fill the gap? Are we able to do that? Are we able as Canadians to feel that we're doing our bit and more when needed? You know, can you talk about that a little bit?
So the answer is probably not. We are looking at a decent harvest season, though. If you look at some of the recent reports, it's pretty decent. Farmers actually are going to make. Sorry.
Oh no. Well, we may have been reading the same information. I'll let you go.
Yeah, we're looking good. Farmers actually are going to make good money. So if you're asking how farmers are impacted by Ukraine, well, they locked in.
Help feed the world. Can we help the world that's starving? That's going to stop.
There are going to be some deficits for probably, I would say, wheat for sure, barley, lentils. Yeah, we're in trouble. Now Canada, and like I said, North America, we're fine. We're going to be good. We're going to be fine. But the rest of the world, and especially because of the droughts in Europe this year, and in Asia, it's going to make things worse. And the vessels.
Can we ship more? Are we doing our best to get the food out?
Are you talking about food aid or?
Yes, I guess I am.
Okay.
Food aid. Well,
yes.
so I mean, for the food aid program run by the UN, 8% of grains came from Ukraine. Guess how much they're getting this year? 0. So
how much does Canada kick in?
I don't know actually. That's a good question. I don't know. But I would say we're in trouble this year. There is going to be famine in parts of the world because of what happened. Vladimir Putin is evil because he picked the worst time ever to invade Ukraine. In February, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that by invading Ukraine, he would be impacting the entire world. And he succeeded, unfortunately.
Yes, your question.
I don't know if this is
something that you can address. But every time I go to a supermarket and I go to pay my bill with my card, it comes up and says, would you like to donate $2, blah, blah, or no thank you, for children's breakfast programs and things like that. And sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. But every time I see that question, I'm totally offended that we have children going to school that need breakfast programs. Why are we being asked, and I mean, some of us can afford it, but why are we being asked to supply food for children going to school when we know that it's necessary for them? Why is there no program? Why is the Canadian government or any government not saying that is outrageous? I think food banks are outrageous, actually. They've been around a lot longer than the breakfast programs are for children. But I don't remember it when I was at school. I'm 75 now. And I don't remember children going to school hungry at that time. And we were a lot less well off then. But why are we so passive about the fact that children are going to school hungry and we're asking everyday people to supply breakfast food or lunch food for them? Why is the government, when we have food, this is a food question to me. I mean, I don't know if it's in your bailiwick, but why are children going, why is the government not making sure that children are getting this food? Why are they depending on the goodwill of people to supply that food for breakfast, for food for kids? That's my question.
It seems that would go to goal number 1. We were talking about
affordability
earlier. But also access to.
And access.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's a good question. So the federal government has, in its last budget, provisions for a national school food program. But I know where it's at right now. I know that there is this recognition that we need a national program for that. And I know that it's been some work in Nova Scotia, but to your point about being solicited to support aid for children, so, I mean, I guess there's a philosophical debate around how we support ourselves. If we go back to March of 2020, the federal government decided to invest over $100 million and send those funds to food banks and Second Harvest in Toronto, and I'm actually on the board of Second Harvest. I'll admit I'm a big believer in food banks because I volunteer. As a family, we volunteer at food banks. I'm a big supporter of food banks, and let me explain to you why. I think that food banks are best positioned to respond to market failures much more quickly than any government programs we would ever have. They can actually run very efficiently, and the way they respond, I mean, a plant closes, people lose jobs, they can respond very, very quickly. We've never institutionalized food banks in Canada until very recently, until the Trudeau government in 2018 was the first government to recognize the existence of food banks. I was invited to Ottawa to have a debate on the existence of food banks that year. And it was a bipartisan sort of committee. It was me, the president of Farm Credit Canada, and I can't remember who else. But anyways, in the room we had many MPs, including Elizabeth May. She was leader of the Green Party, I guess about to become the next leader of the Green Party. I don't know what's going on there, but anyway, I basically said to the committee that I think we need to embrace the existence of food banks. We need to stop thinking that these food banks represent failing policies. To a certain extent, we can say that they do represent failing policies. But at the end of the day, when people have bills to pay and kids to feed, they can't wait 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months for the next check to arrive. They need help. And so if you've been to food banks recently, I mean, they've done I think they're doing a phenomenal job looking at wellness, because people will go to food banks for a variety of reasons. There's mental health, there's physical health, there's tons of reasons why people go to food banks. But to me, food banks are a miracle of the human spirit. It gets communities to work together to support the community. And that's really precious. A year later, after the COVID started, we were called by the Auditor General of Canada to evaluate all the programs that were set forward by the local government to help people in food during COVID. So we looked at agriculture, we looked at processing, all the money. There was about $1 billion spent overall in agri-food and food to help Canadians, to help the industry, restaurants, hospitality. And our panel, we came to the conclusion that the best money spent of $1 billion was that $100 million given to food banks. Because they got a lot of bang for their buck. They did. They actually were able to help a lot of Canadians very quickly. On a dime, they could turn around and really operationalize that funding in a really effective way. So, but I do understand. So when I said that to the committee, Elizabeth May really was offended that I said that food banks should exist. Food banks should not exist. Our goal is to actually get rid of food banks as quickly as possible. And that's kind of what I said to her. Listen, I understand your point. I totally understand your point. But the reality is that in other developed countries like Britain, for example, and even in some states in the US, when people lose jobs, they do refer them to food banks for help, for immediate help, until governments can actually provide some support. So anyway, I'm sure that in the room we have a lot of different opinions on this, but that would be mine.
Thanks, Sue. One more question.
Good morning. I am one of those people who read labels when I buy food, and I was a bit surprised when I read your column about butter, and the fact that the label on butter doesn't include everything that's in butter. And I've since heard that maybe that's true for other products too, that olive oil may not always be olive oil, et cetera, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about what our food labeling policies are and why everything that's in a product isn't on the label?
Yeah, talk about transparency. So you're referring to Buttergate last year. So what came out of Buttergate is that I was aware of the problem. It's just how do you bring the science to demonstrate that there is a problem? And so we tested about 120 samples with Guelph, with University of Guelph, and only to realize that the presence of palmatic acids in butter was very heavily correlated with butter firmness. Butter was not getting softer at room temperature. And a lot of people were telling me this, and so I wanted to have data. And so, how come butter has more palmatic acid? Well, you have to go back to the farm and how animals are fed. And we realized that dairy cows were fed with palm oil. And the reason why they were fed with palm oil is that you can increase the butterfat content in milk per cow. So, you know, if you're, and the money is in butter these days. It's not necessarily fluid milk because people are drinking less milk, but they do buy butter. So dairy farmers just used, and it's not necessarily their fault, they just never thought that it would actually change the quality of the product at retail. They never actually assessed anything until we did. And because we told them, listen, the powder you put on the feed is making butter harder at room temperature. And they said, no, that's impossible. So that's why we tested it. And so all of a sudden, consumers going to their grocery store realize, well, there's palm oil in my butter, and I'm certainly concerned about environmental issues related to palm oil, because you had the Blue Cow campaign, Canadian, and all of a sudden people were hearing about the dairy farmers importing products from Indonesia and Malaysia to feed cows. How does that work? So transparency for sure. Now, when it comes to labeling in Canada, food labeling is governed by Health Canada. So what you see on the label is approved and assessed by Health Canada. The surveillance, the oversight of whether or not the content on the label is accurate, that's the CFIA's job, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. That's how the two worlds are separated. And both don't necessarily talk to each other. So on the one side, you have Health Canada approving this and that, and on the other, you have the CFIA trying to provide some oversight, but they're even though they have 9,000 people, they can't really get to all of the 19,000 products we have in our grocery store. So they are, so we talked about Buttergate, but there are some really critical issues like food fraud, for example. Olive oil. I can tell you in this room right now, including you and I, we've been fooled more than once. Food fraud is a really big problem. And food fraud essentially is your label being accurate. So you go to a grocery store and you buy, I don't know, you buy olive oil. And in that olive oil, you'll have canola oil. So they do that because, well, first of all, canola oil is cheaper and olive oil is more expensive. And by the way, this year, because of what went on with the drought in Europe, guess what's going to happen to olive oil prices? And guess what's going to happen to food fraud? The temptation is there. So be on the lookout and ask questions. If you've ever been to Europe and tasted actual olive oil, you can taste the difference. I mean, there's a huge difference. So we've all been had by food fraud, inaccurate labels. And there are three different kinds of food fraud. One is economically motivated adulteration, replacing one ingredient with another that's cheaper. Counterfeiting, and that's a big one, like theft. Remember the big maple syrup heist?
Yeah.
Did you buy some?
I had mine from here.
That's right. Exactly. But there's a lot of, by the way, each grocery store, the average grocery store will see anywhere between $3,000 to $4,000 worth of theft per week. Yeah. Theft is a real problem. And the last one, of course, is misrepresentation. And so for the local movement, that's a big one. You can actually buy, say, apples from the valley, but they're from Brazil or something. There's a lot of that going on, and that's hard to prove. So the oversight has to be assured by the CFIA, but they don't do everything. They can't oversee the entire food system. It's pretty complicated. But if we are to focus more on local foods, if we are to look at food integrity very seriously, my take is we need to really make sure that we support our food industry very well by monitoring, by testing, randomly testing products once in a while. I work with Guelph, I work with our lab here. Every time we go out, we find stuff. In Halifax, and I don't want to scare you, but I got to tell you, I mean, there is a report out, and we looked at the food service industry. Oh my God. So we sampled dishes in Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. And we tested samples. 60% of the time in Halifax, people were served a dish that was mislabeled on the menu. It wasn't exactly what they ordered. And most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it was a species that was cheaper.
Examples?
I can't think of an example now.
Fish, meats?
Oh, fish. Just fish, yeah, seafood. Sorry, it was just, seafood is a big one. Yeah, seafood is a big one. And that's why this obscurity around fisheries is a big problem for consumers, because It's not an industry that is very transparent. Look at salmon, genetically modified salmon. Genetically modified salmon is commercialized in Canada, and chances are we've all eaten it without knowing it. And so people may say, and we had that discussion this week in my class, in my food policy class. One student said, well, why label if it's not dangerous? Health Canada is telling us it's not dangerous. Why bother? Well, here's the problem that I have as an economist. If I present to you 2 pieces of salmon, one is from a fish farm, let's say, and the other is genetically modified. Both of them are at $18 a kilo. Which one will you pick? The majority of Canadians would probably pick the fish farm one, not the genetically modified. Genetically modified is not appetizing. But here's the deal. To produce a genetically modified salmon costs 60% less. And I suspect that most of you know that. Why would you ever develop a genetically modified salmon? It's to reduce the cost of production. So if you go to the grocery store and you sell your genetically modified salmon, say, $12 a kilo instead of $18, and the other fish is $18 a kilo, which one will you pick? Probably the genetically modified one, because it's cheaper. So you have your answer in terms of why aren't they labeling this thing? They're basically, we're protecting margins. We've actually come a long way. There's been a lot of great things happening in aquaculture, in fisheries, even in livestock, in horticulture. Genetic engineering has done a lot of things, but it was all for industry. Benefits for consumers aren't there. So we need to start, if we are to invest in new technologies in farming and production, we need to start thinking, what's in it for the consumer? And going back to your question on labeling, which is super important, the more information you give to the public, the more they'll recognize the value in whatever you're doing as a farmer or anything like that.
We have just reached our expiry date.
Best before date.
Thank you so much for coming out and listening, and also asking questions.
Oh, I'm the thank you person. I'm here to thank you. And weren't they great? My name is Tina Tucker. I'm a new member of SCANS. I work on the committee. And see, to me, this is the perfect example of why we're all here. It's not only the content, but when you have great facilitators, you go away thinking about something in a slightly different way. I know I have today. So thank you again. Really appreciate it. So I want to thank the Astor Theatre. Couldn't have done this without this partnership, obviously. Thank you. And shout out Katie Hopkins back there. Thank you so much.
First show, Katie, was it? Your first audio, Katie?
Great.
Learned everything. And thank you for the donations to the food bank. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and it's a great example of the whole partnership, between the 3 organizations. So that's great.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, for the benefit of people who weren't here this morning, is this going to be archived on the SCANS website at some point?
Yes, the public lectures are.
Okay.
They can contact our office to get a link.
Did you hear that?
Or will it be up on your website?
I can tell you the truth, I'm not 100% sure. I think it probably will be, but very often then things.
Yep.
Just make sure dairy farmers don't have access to it.
But yes, there is access if they can't find our office phone number.
Okay, thank you. And from your office in the SCANS Halifax office, I also want to thank Bill Lee, because I know he worked with Katie as well on making sure we could deliver on Zoom.
So that's a huge help as well. And other than that, as Susan said, I hope to see you 10 a.m. on the 22nd at Trinity Church. Find out more. Who knows, you might want to become a member. I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.